The shot came from above, not from the tree line ahead, not from the ridgeline to the east. From above, at an angle no one trained for, the kind of trajectory that broke muscle memory before it could save you. Specialist Gary Lund had been walking point for 11 minutes through the cold gray light of an October morning in the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest. He had a photograph of his daughter taped to the inside of his helmet. He had 4 months left on his current enlistment. He stepped through a gap between 2 Douglas firs, and the shot arrived before the sound of it did. And then he was on the ground, and the forest did not pause for him. No one heard the muzzle report. That was the first wrong thing. Nolan Ashby was 58 years old and had not been in a firefight in 9 years. But the body remembers what the mind prefers to forget. Before he had consciously processed the sound of Lund hitting the ground, his legs had carried him behind the largest trunk within reach, a ponderosa pine with bark like layered stone, 3 feet in diameter at chest height, and his back was against it, and his breathing had already slowed to the controlled rhythm that took years to build and never became entirely natural. He was a retired warrant officer, Army intelligence, 27 years, most of it in rooms and vehicles and briefing spaces where the violence happened elsewhere, and he was the one who helped explain it afterward. He had been brought to Ironwood Pass in an official capacity, attached to Captain Jerome Aldgate's Ranger element for what had been described in the official documentation as a training validation exercise in the corridor northwest of the pass. Low-risk environment. Cleared area of operations. Estimated duration 4 hours. He watched Gary Lund not move and understood that several things in that documentation had been false. Captain Jerome Aldgate was a large man, former linebacker at a mid-sized state university, body still carrying the proportions of that era 2 decades past, and he moved quickly for his size. He had the command voice of someone who had been shouting over noise since before he could shave and had learned to make it carry without becoming ragged. He used it now, controlled and clipped, cutting through the cold air. Contact, direction unknown. All elements find cover and freeze. He said it twice. His rangers were already moving. They had been trained until the training was physiological, not cognitive, and they flowed into the timber and pressed into the earth and disappeared behind rock and root and the dense low brush of the forest understory. 11 people, now 10 standing. The second shot came 40 seconds later. Sergeant Marcus Tilney was 12 feet from hard cover when it found him, same descending angle as the first, suppressed to near silence, taking him through the left shoulder and spinning him down into the leaf litter. He was alive. He would stay alive. Ranger Cofield got to him in 8 seconds and applied a compression dressing without standing up. Tilney was out of the fight, but he was breathing, and his eyes were open and tracking. The element absorbed this and kept its discipline. Aldgate gave no order to advance because there was nowhere to advance toward. There was nothing to engage. There was only the forest above them and the silence where the shots had come from, and the growing certainty that they were inside something that had been built before they arrived. 2 shots, 2 origin points, both elevated, both suppressed, both descending at an angle between 50 and 60 degrees from vertical. Nolan had seen enough after-action reports to know what this required. Not one shooter repositioning. Multiple shooters, multiple elevated positions, operating in coordination without radio chatter he could detect, which meant either encrypted comms or pre-established timing sequences. This was not an ambush. An ambush was designed to surprise. This was designed to contain. He looked for Ruth Calloway. She had been added to the element roster at 0500 that morning, 40 minutes before departure, by a direct call from Colonel Bate Quarles to Aldgate's operations officer. She had been described in the brief as a weapons evaluation specialist, present to observe and document. She would not be given tactical assignments. She was not to be integrated into fire teams. Aldgate had received this with the professional composure of a man who had learned to absorb bureaucratic interference without letting it show on his face. And then he had found Nalan in the vehicle bay and said what he actually thought, which was that she looked like she weighed 140 pounds, and he did not understand what Quarles thought she was going to evaluate. Nalan had not argued with this. He had been watching Calloway in the vehicle bay, watching the way she moved, and he had noticed something he had not said aloud because he was not certain enough yet to say anything. She moved like she was conserving something. Not energy, attention. Every motion was deliberate without being stiff. She held the canvas bag across her lap in the vehicle, not stowed in the gear rack, and she looked out the window at the tree line with her eyes making small, precise movements that were not the unfocused gaze of someone watching landscape pass. She was reading something. He had not known what she was reading. He was beginning to know now. He found her behind a fallen hemlock 15 meters to his left. She was flat, perfectly still, and her head was tilted up at roughly 30 degrees, and her eyes were moving along the upper tier of the canopy in the same small, precise increments he had seen in the vehicle. Not fear, not survival scanning, calculation. He moved to her. Low and fast, 3 pushes between trunk cover, and he pressed himself against the hemlock, and she did not flinch or change the angle of her eyes. He said her name quietly. She spoke without looking at him. Her voice had the same temperature as the October air, flat and clear and without heat. 12 positions, hexagonal offset arrangement, each node covering adjacent nodes at 120-degree intervals. Movement in any direction within a 35-meter radius enters crossfire from a minimum of 2 positions. She paused for exactly 1 second. This is not improvised. This is a containment architecture. Nalan said, "How do you know this?" "Because I have seen this pattern before." He waited. She did not offer more. She opened the canvas bag. The rifle that came out of that bag was a bolt-action precision system in a gray-green synthetic stock, suppressor already threaded to the muzzle, optics mounted low and level. The M2010 enhanced sniper rifle. Winchester Magnum, not a weapon someone carries for contingency. A weapon someone carries for purpose. She assembled the final components in 31 seconds. He counted. Her hands did not consult her eyes. Her eyes were on the canopy. Her hands worked from memory that was deeper than conscious recall. To his right, Sergeant First Class Delia Korf had settled behind a granite outcropping with the unhurried efficiency of someone for whom cover selection was automatic. She was the senior weapons NCO, 12 years in, the kind of soldier who carried experience the way some people carry weight, without being able to put it down. She looked at the rifle in Calloway's hands and her face changed. Not surprise, recognition. The specific tightening of a person who has just encountered a fact they were not expecting to meet here, in this place, on this morning. Nalan noted it. He did not address it yet. Calloway called Aldgate on the internal frequency. She spoke without preamble. "Do not return fire. Do not move beyond your current position. Movement within the containment radius will trigger simultaneous engagement from multiple elevated nodes." Aldgate's response was what Nalan had expected. He said he did not take tactical direction from civilian contractors. She released the transmit button without responding. She looked at Nalan and told him Aldgate had 4 minutes before the grid compressed to its secondary configuration. She told him to go convince the captain. He went. He used the word architecture twice. He said the word geometry. He told Aldgate that 2 suppressed shots from 2 separate elevated positions with identical downward trajectories was a pattern, and patterns had names, and the woman with the bolt-action rifle had identified the name. He told Aldgate that the worst thing they could do right now was shoot back at an enemy. They could not locate at an elevation. They had not been trained to engage. While moving through a containment field specifically designed to funnel their response into kill zones. He told Aldgate that Tilney was stable and that Lund was stable, and that the shooter or shooters had chosen not to fire a third round in 4 minutes, which meant they were in a containment phase, not an elimination phase, and containment phases had windows. Aldgate listened. His jaw was set and his eyes moved between Nolan and the upper tree line. He was processing. He gave the order. All elements hold. The forest went quiet, not peaceful quiet, pressurized quiet, the kind that builds rather than releases. Calloway was at the base of a western larch 85 feet tall when Nolan found her again, standing at the root flare with her head tilted back, eyes moving up the trunk in the systematic way of a person selecting a root. The larch had a trunk 2.5 feet in diameter, and bark that plated and fractured in heavy orange-brown slabs. At the second tier, 40 to 50 feet up, the major branches spread wide, some of them 12 inches thick, running horizontal for 15 feet before curving upward at their tips. She studied the tree for 8 seconds, then she began to climb. No rope, no mechanical aid. She climbed with the patient root finding of someone for whom a tree was terrain, and terrain was a problem with a solution. She tested each branch before committing weight. She moved at a pace that was even and consistent, neither rushed nor slow, the pace of someone who understood that hurrying on a vertical surface was the same as hurrying through a minefield. At 40 feet, she adjusted the rifle on her back without stopping. At 60 feet, she reached the second tier and slowed into the canopy, and the canopy took her. And from below, she simply ceased to be visible. Aldgate was beside Nolan. He had moved up silently, which for a man his size was a skill worth noting. He stood looking at the place where Calloway had gone into the canopy and said nothing. His hands were on his rifle. His rifle pointed at the ground. They waited. 40 seconds. 50. The forest offered nothing but the sound of a light wind moving through the upper branches and, far to the east, a hawk calling once and then going silent. The report arrived small and controlled, the suppressor compressing it to a dry syllable. From the northeast, at an estimated 65 feet of elevation, a figure dropped out of the canopy. The harness caught. The man hung there, turning slowly, his right shoulder producing a visible dark stain against his jacket. Alive, conscious enough to make sound, not going to be using that arm again in any meaningful way. She had chosen this. A kill shot from that range at that angle with a .300 Win Mag was not difficult for a shooter of her caliber. She had chosen not to make it. That was a decision, and decisions had reasons, and the reason was not mercy. Aldgate said it quietly, "Why not a kill shot?" It was Korf who answered, and she answered with her voice directed at the ground in front of her, confirming something to herself rather than announcing it to the group. "Because that is Ren." Nolan looked at her. She was looking at the hanging man and the place in the canopy above him where nothing moved. He said, "Who is Ren?" Korf said nothing. She picked up her rifle and adjusted her position behind the granite and did not look at him. Calloway came down carrying a sealed pelican case stripped from the man's harness. She set it on the ground and crouched over it. The case had an embedded screen on the lid. She tried 2 entry codes on the keypad and neither worked, and she sat back on her heels and read what the screen was displaying instead. Nolan read it over her shoulder. Demo Package 7, Live Validation, Client, Redacted, Observer Position, Grid 447,812. He said the word demo slowly, like he was testing it. Calloway stood. She looked at Aldgate and delivered what she knew in the flat, declarative sentences of someone who had prepared this statement in her head and removed everything unnecessary. The arrangement is called Cascade Network. It was developed by a former Delta Force Chief Warrant Officer named Cole Wareham, currently operating as founder and chief executive of Ashgate Defense Systems, a private military contracting firm based out of Reston, Virginia. He attempted to sell this system to the Department of Defense approximately 26 months ago. The proposal was declined because simulation modeling showed collateral damage projections that exceeded acceptable thresholds in any environment adjacent to civilian population. To secure a foreign sale, he requires a live field validation demonstrating effectiveness against trained military personnel under real operational conditions. She looked at the Pelican case. We are providing that validation. We are the proof of concept. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes a fundamental reorientation. Every person who heard it was recalibrating, replacing one frame with another. An American company, an American contractor, a former Delta Force operator using a United States Army Ranger element as a live target demonstration for a foreign arms transaction on American soil. Aldgate said, "You know Wareham." She did not answer. His eyes moved across her face and found nothing to read there. He looked at the Pelican case. He looked at the hanging man above. He looked at Nolan, who gave him nothing either. She was already looking at the canopy again. Nolan moved toward Korf without urgency, occupying adjacent space, looking in the same direction she was looking. He had been doing this kind of thing for 27 years and he was good at it. He said, "You served with her." Korf let a pause sit. Then she said SFAB, before Rimrock. He said, "And you knew who she was before we departed this morning." She did not answer that directly. She said, "I was told not to introduce her to Captain Aldgate by her operational designation." He said, "Quarles told you." She looked at him once briefly and looked away. He let it settle. Then he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand I am not asking on behalf of any administrative interest." He kept his voice at the register of two people having a conversation that looked like no conversation at all. He said, "The reason Quarles did not brief Aldgate on who Calloway is, that reason is still operational. It is still protecting something." He waited. What is it protecting? Korf was quiet for 11 seconds. Then she said, "If Aldgate knew Calloway's designation and operational history, and if Wareham had any access to Aldgate's communications or JBLM's internal manifest review, Wareham would have understood the nature of the threat being walked into his grid before it arrived." She said, "Calloway's value in this corridor depends entirely on Wareham not knowing she is here until she is already inside his network." She paused. "Wareham has a contact inside Army Acquisitions. That contact has access to unit rosters and mission personnel lists. If Calloway appeared on those lists under her real designation, the contact would have flagged it. Wareham would have known," he said, "and instead she appeared as a weapons evaluation specialist." Korf said, "One of dozens assigned to validation exercises in any given quarter. Nothing to flag." He understood. The brief had not been incomplete because Quarles was withholding information from Aldgate out of institutional politics. The brief had been incomplete because the incompleteness was the cover. Wareham's contact would have reviewed the manifest. The manifest showed a weapons evaluator. Nothing more. By the time Wareham understood what he actually had inside his grid, it was already too late to change the conditions. He thought about the architecture of this, the precision of it. He thought about someone building a plan with that kind of patience and that kind of structural intelligence. He thought about Quarles giving him his folder 3 days ago and saying the element he was not being briefed on would become clear in the field. He was beginning to see the shape of what he had been walked into. It was larger than the corridor. It was larger than one morning in October in a national forest in Washington state. He did not say any of this to Korf. He nodded once and moved back toward the tree where Calloway had been working. A second controlled report came from the northwest. The sound of someone falling through branches, then the harness arresting the fall, then stillness. Calloway working, methodical, taking people off the board without taking them out of the world. He had begun to understand that the decisions were not tactical. They were evidentiary. Every person she left alive was a piece of evidence that had not yet been destroyed. She was building a case. She came down from the second tree carrying another radio unit. She handed it to Nolan without explanation, the way you hand something to someone you expect to know what to do with it, and went back to her position at the base of the larch. The radio was live. He held it and listened to the traffic, encrypted and clipped, professional, the cadence of people who were trained and not afraid. He caught fragments without context. Then the traffic stopped. 4 seconds of silence. Then a voice that was not part of the tactical traffic came through, and it was calm in a way that the tactical traffic had not been. The calm of a man in his own environment, speaking at his own pace, to an audience he had already identified. "Calloway, I know you are listening. Tell Nolan Ashby to check the left chest pocket of his jacket." Nolan became very still. The voice knew his name, not Warrant Officer Ashby, not the civilian observer attached to the element. Nolan, his given name. There was no operational explanation for that name in a radio transmission from a private military contractor conducting a live validation exercise in the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest. He looked at Calloway. She was already looking at him. He reached into the left chest pocket of his field jacket. His fingers found a small envelope, the standard office kind, sealed. He turned it over. His name was written on the front in small, precise handwriting. He had not put it there. He had worn this jacket the previous evening at a briefing at JBLM, moving through corridors and rooms with access restrictions that should have made the jacket untouchable by anyone outside his clearance tier. Should have. He filed that question away. He opened the envelope. The photograph inside was 4 inches by 6. Telephoto lens, taken from significant distance, good resolution. He recognized the terrain from the reports he had studied. The broken granite and pale standing trunks of the Rimrock Basin corridor in Montana. The timestamp in the lower right corner was 22 months old. In the photograph, a figure was ascending a lodgepole pine at perhaps 20 feet of elevation, rifle across the back, moving with the consistent efficiency of someone for whom climbing was not effort but vocabulary. He could not see her face from this distance, an angle, but the shape of the movement and the profile of the rifle were not ambiguous. Below her on the ground, 30 meters back, a man stood looking up. He was in full kit. He was alive. You could see the upward angle of his head, the attentiveness of it, the posture of someone watching a person they needed to survive reach a position that would allow survival. Below the image, in small, precise handwriting, she was already up the tree. Nolan held the photograph and looked at it for a long time. Then he extended it toward Calloway. She looked at it for 3 seconds without taking it. Something moved through her eyes, not pain because she had already worked past the acute version of this into something chronic, not surprise because she knew exactly what this was. It was the expression of someone encountering an unresolved accounting, a debt that had not been settled in a ledger she kept privately. She took the photograph. She did not look at it again. She held it against her leg with 2 fingers. Aldgate said, "Who is Wareham talking to?" He said it with the directness of a man who had run out of patience for information arriving in installments. Nalan looked at Calloway. He looked at the canopy above her, at the places where she had been and left living evidence of her passage. He looked at Korf, who was watching Calloway with the particular attention of someone who knows more than they are saying and is waiting for the moment when saying it becomes permitted. He thought about architecture. He thought about how a containment grid worked. He thought about what it meant to be brought somewhere under deliberately incomplete information from two different directions for a purpose that neither party had been told entirely. He said to her, he gestured at Calloway, and to me. He paused. He said, Wareham knew this element was coming into this corridor. He knew my name and he knew my jacket pocket because he has a source inside the institution that gave him access to the manifest, the personnel assignments, and enough operational detail to prepare a message before we arrived. He said, this grid was not designed to stop an 11-person ranger element as its primary objective. He looked at Calloway. She was looking at the canopy. Her right hand was on the rifle. Her left hand held the photograph against her thigh with two fingers that had never once trembled when loading a round. She said it without turning her head, without anything that sounded like revelation, because to her it was not a revelation. It was the confirmation of something she had suspected from the moment she saw the pattern in the canopy and recognized the geometry of what had been built here, and for whom. This grid was built to bring me back. The radio in Nolan's hand came alive. The same voice, the same unnatural stillness at its center. Welcome back, Wren. I have been waiting 22 months. The October light moved through the upper branches. The hawk called once more to the east and went silent. The forest held everything in suspension, the way forests hold things, without judgment and without release, indifferent to the weight of what has just been spoken and what is about to begin. End of Part 1, when the canopy fires back. Word count, approximately 2,950 words. Full version with complete atmospheric and retention, BEATS continues. The shot came from above. Not from the tree line ahead, not from the ridgeline to the east. From above, at an angle no one trained for, the kind of trajectory that broke muscle memory before it could save you. Specialist Gary Lund had been walking point for 11 minutes through the cold gray light of an October morning in the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest. He had a photograph of his daughter taped to the inside of his helmet. He had 4 months left on his current enlistment. He stepped through a gap between two Douglas firs, and the shot arrived before the sound of it did, and then he was on the ground, and the forest did not pause for him. No one heard the muzzle report. That was the first wrong thing. Nolan Ashby was 58 years old and had not been in a firefight in 9 years, but the body remembers what the mind prefers to forget. Before he had consciously processed the sound of Lund hitting the ground, his legs had carried him behind the largest trunk within reach, a ponderosa pine with bark like layered stone, 3 feet in diameter at chest height, and his back was against it, and his breathing had already slowed to the controlled rhythm that took years to build and never became entirely natural. He was a retired warrant officer. Army intelligence, 27 years, most of it in rooms and vehicles and briefing spaces where the violence happened elsewhere, and he was the one who helped explain it afterward. He had been brought to Ironwood Pass in an official capacity, attached to Captain Jerome Aldgate's Ranger element for what had been described in the official documentation as a training validation exercise in the corridor northwest of the pass. Low-risk environment. Cleared area of operations. Estimated duration 4 hours. He had read the documentation 3 times in the preceding 72 hours because 3-time reading was his habit with any document that used the word low in proximity to the word risk, and each reading had produced in him the specific professional unease of someone who had spent a career learning to read what official documents were designed not to say. He watched Gary Lund not move and understood that he had been right to be uneasy. Captain Jerome Aldgate was a large man, former linebacker at a mid-sized state university, body still carrying the proportions of that era 2 decades past, and he moved quickly for his size. He had the command voice of someone who had been shouting over noise since before he could shave and had learned to make it carry without becoming ragged. He used it now, controlled and clipped, cutting through the cold air of the corridor. Contact, direction unknown. All elements find cover and freeze. He said it twice. His rangers were already moving. They had been trained until the training was physiological, not cognitive, and they flowed into the timber and pressed into the earth and disappeared behind rock and root and the dense low brush of the forest understory. 11 people, now 10 standing. The second shot came 40 seconds later. Sergeant Marcus Tilney was 12 feet from hard cover when it found him. Same descending angle as the first, suppressed to near silence. It took him through the left shoulder and spun him down into the leaf litter. He was alive. Ranger Cofield reached him in 8 seconds with a compression dressing, moving low and fast, and Tilney's eyes were open and tracking by the time Cofield had the dressing applied. Alive, breathing, out of the fight. The element absorbed this and kept its discipline, because that was what training produced, the ability to absorb damage and maintain form when every instinct was pointed in the opposite direction. 2 shots, 2 origin points, both elevated, both suppressed, both descending at an angle between 50 and 60 degrees from vertical. Nolan had seen enough after-action reports to know what this required. Not one shooter repositioning. Multiple shooters at multiple elevated positions operating in coordination, without radio traffic he could detect, which meant pre-established timing or encrypted comms running on a frequency his gear did not cover. This was not an ambush. An ambush was designed to surprise. What he was inside had been designed to contain. He looked for Ruth Calloway. She had been added to the element roster at 0500 that morning, 40 minutes before departure, by a direct call from Colonel Bate Quarles to Aldgate's operations officer, weapons evaluation specialist, present to observe and document, not to be given tactical assignments, not to be integrated into fire teams. Aldgate had received this instruction with the professional composure of a man who had learned to absorb institutional interference without letting it show on his face. And then he had found Nolan in the vehicle bay and said what he actually thought about it, quietly, which was that she looked like she weighed 140 pounds, and he did not understand what Quarles thought a weapons evaluator was going to contribute to a validation exercise in the field. Nolan had not argued with this. He had been watching Calloway in the vehicle bay, watching the way she moved, and he had noticed something he had kept to himself because he was not certain enough yet to say it. She moved like she was conserving something. Not energy, attention. Every motion was deliberate without being stiff. She held the canvas bag across her lap in the vehicle rather than stowing it in the gear rack, and she looked out the window at the tree line with her eyes making small, precise movements that were not the unfocused gaze of someone watching landscape pass. She was reading the trees. He had not known what she was reading. He was beginning to understand now. He found her behind a fallen hemlock 15 meters to his left. She was flat against the ground, perfectly still, head tilted up at roughly 30 degrees, eyes moving along the upper tier of the canopy in the same small, precise increments he had watched in the vehicle. Not fear, not survival scanning for escape routes, calculation, the methodical collection of data from a source that no one else in the element was looking at. He moved to her. Low and fast, 3 pushes between trunk cover, and he pressed himself against the hemlock, and she did not flinch or redirect her eyes. He said her name. She spoke without looking at him. Her voice had the same temperature as the October air, flat and clear and without heat. 12 positions. Hexagonal offset arrangement. Each node covering adjacent nodes at 120-degree intervals. Movement in any direction within a 35-meter radius enters crossfire from a minimum of 2 positions simultaneously. She paused. This is not improvised. This is a containment architecture. Someone built this before we arrived. Nolan said, "How do you know this?" "Because I have seen this pattern before." He waited for elaboration. She opened the canvas bag instead. The rifle that came out of that bag was a bolt-action precision system in a gray-green synthetic stock, suppressor already threaded to the muzzle, optics mounted low and level. The M2010 enhanced sniper rifle. Winchester Magnum, not a weapon someone carries for contingency planning. A weapon someone carries for a specific purpose they have identified in advance. She assembled the final components in 31 seconds. He counted because counting gave him something to do with the part of his attention that had no other task. Her hands did not look at what they were doing. Her eyes stayed on the canopy. Her hands worked from a depth of repetition that had passed beyond skill into something closer to instinct. To his right, Sergeant First Class Delia Korf had settled behind a granite outcropping with the unhurried efficiency of someone for whom cover selection had become automatic long ago. She was the senior weapons NCO, 12 years in, the kind of soldier who wore experience without announcement, who saw situations in sequence rather than as collections of simultaneous problems. She looked at the rifle in Calloway's hands and her face changed. Not surprise, recognition. The tightening of a person who has encountered a specific fact in an unexpected location and is processing what that encounter means. He noted it, he did not address it yet. There was an order to things. Calloway called Aldgate on the internal frequency. She spoke without preamble. "Do not return fire. Do not move beyond your current position. Movement within the containment radius will trigger simultaneous engagement from multiple elevated nodes. Any direction, any range under 35 meters." Aldgate's response was what Nolan had expected. "I do not take tactical direction from civilian contractors." She released the transmit without responding. She looked at Nolan and told him Aldgate had 4 minutes before the grid compressed into its secondary configuration. She told him to go convince the captain. He went. He used the word architecture twice. He said the word geometry. He told Aldgate that 2 shots from 2 separate elevated positions with identical suppressed trajectories was not a coincidence and was not a reactive ambush, and was not anything that standard counter-ambush drills had been designed to address. He told Aldgate that the woman with the bolt-action rifle had named the pattern, and that naming a pattern was different from guessing, and that the difference mattered enormously right now. He told Aldgate that Tilney was stable, that Lund was stable, that no third shot had been fired in 5 minutes, which indicated a containment phase rather than an elimination phase, and that containment phases had windows that elimination phases did not have. Aldgate listened with his jaw set and his eyes moving between Nolan and the upper distance. He was a man who had built his operational understanding of the battlefield on identifiable enemies and external threats with comprehensible motivations. What Nolan was describing sat outside that framework. He was processing the distance between what he had expected this morning to be and what it had become. He gave the order. "All elements hold." The forest went quiet, not peaceful, pressurized, the kind of quiet that builds rather than releases. Calloway was at the base of a western larch 85 feet tall when Nolan found her again, standing at the root flare with her head tilted back, eyes tracing the root up the trunk in the systematic way of someone reading a path rather than evaluating one. The larch had plated bark in heavy orange-brown slabs. At the second tier, 40 to 50 feet up, the major branches spread wide and flat, some of them 12 inches thick at the shoulder, running horizontal for 15 feet before curving upward at their tips. She studied the tree for 8 seconds. Then she began to climb. No rope, no mechanical aid. She climbed with the patient root-finding efficiency of someone for whom a tree was terrain, and terrain was a problem with a solution that required only patience and attention. She tested each branch before committing weight. She moved at a pace that was even and consistent, neither rushed nor slow, the pace of someone who understood that hurrying on a vertical surface produced the same consequences as hurrying through a minefield. At 40 feet, she adjusted the rifle on her back without stopping. At 60 feet, she reached the second tier and the canopy took her, and from below she simply ceased to be visible. Aldgate had moved up beside Nolan without announcement. He stood looking at the place where Calloway had disappeared and said nothing. His hands were on his rifle pointed at the ground. They waited. 40 seconds, 50. The forest offered nothing but the sound of a light wind in the upper branches and, far to the east, a hawk calling once and going silent. The report arrived small and controlled, the suppressor compressing it to a dry syllable in the cold air. From the northeast, at an estimated 65 feet of elevation, a figure dropped out of the canopy. The harness caught. The man hung there, turning slowly, his right shoulder showing a dark stain against the jacket. Alive, conscious enough to make sound. He would not be using that arm in any purposeful way for a long time. She had chosen this. A .300 Win mag at that range, at that angle from a shooter of her caliber, offered a wide range of outcomes. She had selected a specific one, incapacitation rather than termination. That was a decision, and decisions had reasons, and the reason was not sentiment. Aldgate said it quietly, "Why not a kill shot?" It was Korf who answered. She said it with her voice directed at the ground in front of her, in the tone of a person confirming something to themselves rather than announcing it. "Because that is Wren." Nolan looked at her. She was looking at the hanging man and the place in the canopy above him where nothing moved. He said, "Who is Wren?" Korf said nothing. She picked up her rifle, adjusted her position, and did not look at him. Calloway came down from the tree carrying a sealed pelican case stripped from the man's harness. She set it on the ground and crouched over it. The case had an embedded screen on the lid. She tried 2 entry codes on the keypad and neither opened it. She sat back on her heels and read what the screen was displaying instead. Nolan read it over her shoulder. Demo Package 7, Live Validation, Client, Redacted, Observer Position, Grid 447,812. He said the word demo once, slowly, as if the act of saying it would help him understand why it was here. Calloway stood. She looked at Aldgate and delivered what she knew in the flat, declarative sentences of someone who had prepared this statement and removed everything that was not necessary. The arrangement is called Cascade Network. It was developed by a former Delta Force Chief Warrant Officer named Cole Wareham, currently operating as founder and chief executive of Ashgate Defense Systems, a private military contracting firm based in Reston, Virginia. He attempted to sell this system to the Department of Defense approximately 26 months ago. The proposal was declined because simulation modeling projected collateral damage at levels that exceeded any acceptable threshold in environments adjacent to civilian populations. To secure a foreign sale, he requires a live field validation demonstrating effectiveness against trained military personnel under real operational conditions. She looked at the Pelican case. "We are the validation. We are what he is selling to whoever is on that ridge watching through a drone feed right now." The silence after this was a different silence than the one before. Every person who heard it was replacing one frame with another. An American company, American contractors, a former Delta Force officer using a United States Army Ranger element as a live-fire product demonstration for a foreign buyer, on American soil, in a national forest 40 miles from a major military installation. Aldgate said, "You know Wareham?" She did not answer. His eyes moved across her face and found nothing to read there. He looked at the pelican case. He looked at the man hanging 65 feet above them. He looked at Nolan, who gave him nothing in return, because Nolan did not yet have everything he needed to give. She was already reading the canopy again. Nolan moved to Korf. He had a specific question, and he asked it directly because they were past the point where indirection served anyone in the element. He said, "You served with her." Korf let a pause settle, then she said, "SFAB, before Rimrock." He said, "You knew who she was before we departed this morning." She did not answer directly. She said, "I was told not to introduce her to Captain Aldgate by her operational designation." He said, "Quarles told you that." She looked at him once briefly and looked away. He said, "I need you to help me understand something, and I am asking as a person, not as a documentation officer." He kept his voice at the register of two people having a quiet conversation. He said Quarles kept Calloway's identity off the tactical brief. And the reason that matters right now is that Wareham has a contact inside Army Acquisitions. That contact reviewed the mission manifest before we departed. If Calloway had appeared on that manifest under her real designation and operational history, that contact would have flagged it to Wareham before we ever got into the vehicles. Korf was quiet for a moment. Then she said that was the reasoning she had been given. She said Wareham's contact had access to personnel assignments at the unit roster level. Calloway appearing as a weapons evaluation specialist was standard, unremarkable, one of dozens on similar assignments in any given month, nothing that would trigger a flag. He said so the incomplete brief was not negligence, it was the cover. She said yes. He understood it then. He understood the shape of what Quarles had built and what she had needed him not to know in advance. He thought about the folder on her desk 3 days ago. He thought about what she had said when he asked if he needed to be armed. He thought about the particular way that incomplete information, strategically placed, could function as precision more accurately than any direct instruction. He did not say any of this. He nodded once and returned to watching the forest. A second controlled report came from the northwest. The sound of someone falling through branches, then the harness catching, then stillness. Calloway working, methodical. Every person she left alive was a witness. She was building something that required witnesses. She came down from the second tree carrying another radio unit. She handed it to Nolan without comment. The way you hand something to someone you expect will know its purpose. She went back to her position at the base of the larch. The radio was live. He held it and listened. Encrypted and professional, the cadence of trained people who were not panicking. Then the traffic stopped. 4 seconds. Then a voice that was not part of the tactical traffic. Calm in a different way. The calm of a man speaking from a position of his own choosing, at his own pace, to an audience he had already located. "Calloway, I know you are listening. Tell Nolan Ashby to check the left chest pocket of his jacket." Nolan went entirely still. The voice knew his name, his given name, Nolan, the name on his library card, the name his daughter had grown up with. There was no operational explanation for that name in a radio transmission from a private contractor running a live demonstration exercise in the Okanogan corridor. No explanation unless someone with access to personnel files and movement schedules had provided it. someone who had also had access to him, specifically, at some point in the preceding 12 hours. He looked at Calloway. She was already looking at him. He reached into the left chest pocket of his field jacket. His fingers found a small envelope, standard office size, sealed. His name on the front in small, precise handwriting. He had not put it there. He had worn this jacket the previous evening at a briefing at JBLM, moving through corridors with access control that should have made the jacket untouchable by anyone outside his clearance tier. The jacket had been in his vehicle overnight. The vehicle had been in the JBLM motor pool. He filed the access question away. He would return to it. He opened the envelope. The photograph inside was 4 by 6 inches. Telephoto lens, significant range, good resolution, taken by someone who knew how to use a long lens in low light. The terrain was recognizable from the reports he had studied. The broken granite and pale standing trunks of the Rimrock Basin corridor in Montana. The timestamp in the lower right corner was 22 months old. In the photograph, a figure was ascending a lodgepole pine at perhaps 20 feet of elevation, rifle across the back, moving with the consistent efficiency of someone for whom climbing was not effort but language. He could not see her face, but the shape of the movement and the profile of the rifle were not ambiguous. Below her on the ground, 30 meters back, a man stood looking up, full kit, alive. You could see the angle of his head, the attentiveness of it, the posture of someone watching a person they needed to survive reach a position from which survival was possible. Below the image, in the same small, precise handwriting as the envelope, she was already up the tree. Nolan held the photograph and looked at it for a long time. Then he extended it toward Calloway. She looked at it for 3 seconds without taking it. Something moved through her eyes, not pain because she had already processed pain into something flatter and more permanent, not recognition because she already knew what this was. It was the expression of someone confronting an accounting that had not been settled, in a ledger she maintained privately and reviewed often. She took the photograph. She did not look at it again. She held it against her leg with 2 fingers, the same 2 fingers that had assembled a precision rifle in 31 seconds without looking at her hands. Aldgate said, "Who is Wareham talking to?" He said it with the flatness of a man who had decided that whatever he was about to hear, he was going to hear it without visible reaction. Nolan looked at Calloway. He looked at the canopy above her, at the places where she had been and left living evidence of her methods. He looked at Korf, who was watching Calloway with the steady attention of someone waiting for the moment when saying the thing they know becomes necessary rather than premature. He thought about architecture. He thought about the geometry of a containment grid. He thought about what it meant to be brought somewhere under deliberately incomplete orders from 2 separate directions, for a purpose that neither party had been told in full. He said to her, he gestured at Calloway, and to me, he paused. This grid was not built to neutralize an 11-person Ranger element as its primary objective. He looked at Calloway. She was looking at the canopy. Her right hand was on the rifle. Her left hand held the photograph against her thigh with 2 fingers that had never once trembled when loading a round into the chamber of a weapon she had carried for 10 years. She said it without turning her head, without drama, without anything that sounded like revelation, because to her it was not a revelation. It was the confirmation of something she had understood from the moment she read the geometry in the upper canopy and recognized what it had been built to catch. This grid was built to bring me back. The radio in Nolan's hand came alive. The same voice, the same stillness at its center. "Welcome back, Wren. I have been waiting 22 months. The October light moved through the upper branches in long, pale columns. The hawk called once more from the east and went silent. The forest held everything in suspension, the way a forest holds things, without judgment and without release, indifferent to the weight of what had just been spoken and what was about to follow. No one moved for a long time after the radio went quiet. The voice had said what it said and then withdrawn, and the forest closed back around the silence the way water closes around a stone, smooth and immediate and indifferent to the weight of what had just been spoken. Nolan Ashby held the radio at his side and felt its weight differently than he had 60 seconds before. Same equipment, different weight. He looked at Ruth Calloway. She had not changed her position. Back against the larch, rifle at a low carry, left hand still holding the photograph against her thigh with 2 fingers. Her eyes were on the upper canopy, but they had gone still in a way they had not been still before. She was no longer reading the trees. She was somewhere inside herself, in the particular private space that opens when a name from the past arrives without warning, and the full weight of what that name carries arrives with it. 22 months. Nolan did the arithmetic. 22 months put her at Rimrock Basin in Montana. The incident report he had studied described what happened there as a training accident. It described the subsequent reassignment of the element's surviving senior sniper as voluntary. In 27 years of reading official documentation, Nolan had developed sensitivity to the way institutional language was used to describe events that institutions needed to have occurred differently than they had. The word voluntary in that report had produced in him the specific unease of a practiced reader, encountering a word used to mean its opposite. He had not said this to anyone. He had kept it the way you keep things in this profession, filed in the place where useful information waits until the moment it becomes necessary. Captain Jerome Aldgate broke the silence the way he broke most silences, with the forward momentum of a man who processed disruption by immediately building structure to replace what had been destroyed. He needed a sitrep. He needed a communication window. He needed an exfil option. He said this to his senior NCOs in the flat declarative sequence of a commander converting chaos into a list of solvable problems. Delia Korff said the radio situation was the obstacle. She had been working the frequencies since the first shot and getting fragments. Nothing clean, nothing they could transmit through reliably. The ridge geometry and the corridor elevation were working against them. They needed higher ground or a relay, and both required movement, and movement inside a cascade network containment field was the one variable Calloway had told them would accelerate rather than resolve their problem. Aldgate looked at Calloway. She came back from wherever she had been. Not dramatically. Her eyes refocused and her posture made a small adjustment against the bark, and she looked at Aldgate with the level attentiveness she had been carrying since the vehicle bay, the expression of someone who has already worked through the next several problems and is waiting for the conversation to catch up. She said there were 9 positions remaining in the Cascade network grid. She had neutralized 3. The 9 remaining were holding static configuration until Wareham triggered the Phase 2 transition, which she estimated at 12 to 18 minutes based on the timing intervals she had observed from elevation. In the static configuration, the hexagonal geometry produced 2 dead channels in the northern quadrant, each approximately 40 meters wide, gaps where the overlapping coverage arcs of adjacent nodes failed to intersect. She could navigate through the eastern dead channel to reach the ridge spur at grid reference 447. At that elevation, they would have a clean transmission window to JBLM. Aldgate said you can map a dead channel in a 12-position hexagonal grid after 3 minutes in a tree. She said, I have seen this pattern before. He had heard her say this twice already. This time he absorbed it differently. He looked at her for 4 seconds, the look of a man filing a fact under a category he is still constructing, and then he looked at the ridge spur she had indicated and began calculating the route. Nolan moved to Korff. He had a specific question, and he asked it directly, because they were past the point where indirection served either of them. He said the file Carrie sent you. He said it quietly, watching the tree line as he spoke. Does it exist? Korf went still in the way of someone who was not surprised to be asked, but had been carrying the anticipation of the question long enough that its arrival still required a moment of adjustment. He did not give her space for a deflection. He said, I am not asking you to violate orders or confirm anything Quarles told you to protect. He said we are inside an active live-fire validation exercise being conducted by a private military contractor for the purpose of demonstrating a weapons architecture to a foreign client. And the person in this element who understands how to get us out of it is carrying something unresolved. And unresolved things kill people in the field. He stopped. Then he said Carrie sent something for her. I need to know what you know. Korf kept her eyes on the eastern tree line. 15 seconds. 20. Then she said 18 months ago. Encrypted. He told her the decryption key would come from Callaway. He told her to wait until Callaway was in an active operation with a direct connection to Wareham. Nolan said, and here we are. She said, and here we are. He said, show her. Korf moved to Callaway without ceremony, crouching beside her and holding the phone out at the angle of someone presenting a thing rather than offering it. She said, Floyd, Carrie sent this before Rimrock. She said it has been waiting for you. Callaway looked at the phone. She looked at the encrypted file icon, its small padlock symbol, the indicator of a container that had been sealed for 18 months in the pocket of a woman who had done exactly what a dying man had asked of her without knowing why. Something crossed Callaway's face that Nolan had not seen there before. Not grief, because grief had been processed and reprocessed over 22 months into something flatter and more permanent. Something closer to the recognition of an obligation. The quiet acknowledgement of a thing that has been waiting for you to be ready to receive it. She said the decryption key. 11 characters, alphanumeric, spoken slowly and without hesitation, the way you recite something you learned before you understood what you were learning it for. Korf entered the characters. The file opened. Inside was a chain of internal communications. 14 exchanges between a private account registered to Cole Wareham and a government email address with a domain suffix that identified its origin as Army Acquisitions. The exchanges spanned 8 months. They were written in the shorthand of people who knew they should not be writing what they were writing, but who had operated long enough inside protected institutional space that the awareness of risk had faded into background noise. The content, once you had the context, was not complex. Wareham had been receiving information from inside Army Acquisitions, scheduled training exercises, route plans, unit compositions moving through remote terrain corridors. The Rimrock Basin exercise had not been selected randomly. The route, the timing, the unit configuration, all of it had been provided to Wareham in advance by someone inside the institution. Carrie had found the communication chain. Carrie had understood what he was looking at. And Carrie had died in a remote Montana corridor in what the official investigation had termed a training accident, a designation applied to the file within 72 hours and sealed for 5 years under a classification level that would have required Carrie to still be alive to challenge. Nolan read it over Callaway's shoulder. He read it slowly and he read it twice. He said Carrie found this before Rimrock. She said yes. He said, and the exercise was built around Carrie's element, the route, the timing, all of it provided in advance. She said yes. He said so Rimrock was not a training accident. Rimrock was a Cascade Network version 1 live validation. Carrie's element was the dataset, the same as we are now. She said nothing. She did not need to. Nolan looked at the photograph still in her hand. She was already up the tree. He thought about what those words meant in the light of what he had just read. He thought about what a man does when he has discovered a conspiracy inside his own institution, when he knows an operation has been designed around his element, when he cannot abort without revealing that he knows and destroying the only evidence that the conspiracy exists. He thought about what decisions remain when all the direct options have been foreclosed. He said the photograph Wareham put in my pocket. She was already up the tree. He intended you to read it as an accusation, that you were in position when the shooting started and you chose the tree over Carrie. Calloway was quiet. He said, but that is not what the photograph shows. If Carrie sent you up the tree before the ambush started, he did it because he knew the ambush was coming. He sent you up before the grid activated because reaching operating position in a canopy after the first shots have been fired is not possible. He sent you up under the cover of a documentation exercise because it was the only way to get you to elevation without triggering Wareham's prepositioned shooters. She looked at the photograph in her hand. For the first time since he had given it to her, she really looked at it. The figure on the ground, the upward angle of the head, the posture of a man watching a person he needed to survive reach the position that would allow survival. She said it very quietly. He told me to go up. Nolan said yes. She said he told me the view from the second tier would give me better documentation angles. I thought he meant the exercise documentation. Nolan said he meant a different kind. She was quiet for a long time. She put the photograph in the cargo pocket of her jacket with the deliberate flatness of someone filing something under a new category. Her hand came back out and rested on the rifle, and the quality of her stillness had changed. The unresolved accounting he had read in her face since she first looked at that photograph had shifted. It was no longer a debt she owed. It had become a debt that had been entrusted to her. There is a difference between those two things. The difference is the difference between a weight that crushes and a weight that directs, and he could see in the set of her shoulders that she felt it. They moved north through the dead channel. She led them through it in a column with 2-meter spacing and deliberate pace. Not running. Running was acoustic signature. Running was the kind of movement that a dynamic grid could track even through coverage gaps. She called position windows in measured increments, 30 seconds ahead of each move, navigating a geometry that existed only in her head and was accurate enough to carry 11 people through it without a shot fired. They reached the ridge spur without incident. Korf established contact with JBLM on the second attempt. The transmission window was narrow but sufficient. She said Cascade Network. She said Ashgate Defense Systems. She read the client code from the Pelican case screen. She read the observer grid coordinates. She requested immediate command consultation and confirmation of threat classification. The response came from an aide, not Quarles. Transmission logged. Mission timeline extended. No extraction before 1800 hours. And then the message Quarles had sent through the aide, delivered in the flat, neutral voice of someone reading text that was not theirs. Colonel Quarles sends, tell Calloway full package her call. Aldgate looked at Korf. His voice was level in the way of a man who has decided that whatever he is about to hear, he is going to hear it cleanly. Korf said there was a second objective, beyond neutralizing the Cascade Network deployment. She said Quarles had designated it Ghost Archive, a hardened server system containing the complete Cascade Network design documentation and version history, the full record of Wareham's client correspondence and foreign sales contacts, and the identity of the Army Acquisitions contact, who had been supplying Wareham with operational intelligence for a minimum of 2 years. Aldgate said, and the reason this was not briefed to my element. Korf said Wareham's contact inside Army Acquisitions had access to unit rosters and mission personnel lists at the assignment level. If the Ghost Archive retrieval had appeared as a mission objective on any document the contact could review, the contact would have notified Wareham and the archive would have been destroyed before the element arrived in the corridor. Aldgate said so. The incomplete brief was the operation. Korf said, "Yes, sir." He processed this. He looked at Calloway. The look on his face was the particular expression of a man who has been revising a long-held position and has arrived, not without cost, at the point where the revision is complete. He said, "Do you know where the archive is?" She said, "Not yet." He said, "Can you find it?" She said Carrie would have left a marker, something she would recognize and no one else would. She said it with the quiet certainty of someone who has been given a gift they did not understand until the moment they needed it. She said, "I need elevation." And then the grid changed. Nolan felt it before he heard it, a shift in the texture of the silence, something in the quality of sound across the canopy that altered by a degree too small to name but too real to dismiss. He had been in enough situations to trust this feeling without requiring an explanation for it. He said, "Something is moving." Calloway was already reading the canopy. She said the static configuration was gone. Wareham had initiated Phase 2. The remaining shooters were repositioning dynamically on a 90-second cycle. She was reading the movement through the upper canopy, the micro-disturbances in leaf and branch that each repositioning created, visible from the ground if you knew what you were looking at, and were looking from the right angle with 22 months of accumulated reason to see it clearly. She went up a grand fir 80 meters northeast, taller than the previous trees, its crown clearing the surrounding canopy by 20 feet, offering line of sight across the northern and eastern quadrants of the grid. She reached the second tier in under 2 minutes and kept climbing, past the major branches, into the thinning zone where the trunk narrowed and the wind was different, and each step required fresh negotiation between her weight and the capacity of wood to support it. At 90 feet she found her position. Below, Nolan counted 7 seconds of stillness, then a single suppressed report, clean, deliberate. From the eastern quadrant, at a range he estimated at 410 meters, a figure left its position in the canopy. It did not come back up. 11 seconds of stillness. Another report, 380 meters northwest quadrant, another figure down. 2 shooters, 2 positions, identified through the movement signature of a dynamic repositioning algorithm running on a 90-second cycle, read from 90 feet in the air, engaged at ranges that the .300 Winchester Magnum was built for, and that the woman behind it had been built by a decade of specialized training to reach. 2 controlled bolt-action shots, 11 seconds apart, each one a deliberate decision rather than a reaction. Aldgate said nothing. He had stopped trying to frame what he was seeing in language. He was watching, and Nolan understood this because he was doing the same thing. She came down carrying a memory card in a waterproof sleeve, stripped from the second shooter's equipment kit. She handed it to Korf without comment. Korf worked through the directory on her field tablet and looked up. She said there was a partial deployment map, 12 positions numbered and GPS tagged. She said there was also a secondary location, tagged separately from the grid deployment. She read the coordinates aloud. She said the tag label was not a position number. It was a single word. Client. Nolan said client. Korf said the foreign buyer's observer team is at that position. She turned the tablet so Aldgate could see the screen. She said they are approximately 220 meters northwest of our current position on an elevated ridge spur with line of sight across the primary grid. She said the tag includes a data field. She read it. SA-7. Nolan said that word aloud. Aldgate looked at him. He said, "What is SA-7? Nolan said it is a DoD internal country code. It designates a specific adversarial nation, with an active interest in acquiring technology that degrades the effectiveness of American and Allied small unit operations in forested terrain environments. He paused. He said, if Wareham completes this demonstration and delivers the Cascade Network design package to SA-7's acquisition representatives, this is not a private military contractor legal matter. This is an Arms Export Control Act violation. This is material support to an adversarial intelligence service. He said this is what the Ghost Archive proves. The silence that followed was different from any of the silences that had come before it. It was the silence of a group of people who have just had the full dimension of a thing revealed and are measuring the distance between what they thought they were doing this morning and what they were actually doing. Aldgate said to Calloway, "Find the archive." Calloway was already looking at the memory card coordinates Korf had read aloud. Something in her face settled, the small alignment of expectation and arrival. She said Carey marked caches with a lodgepole pine cutting, a carved X at the root flare, 6 inches above ground level, on the north-facing surface of the trunk. He had taught it to her at Fort Benning. He had framed it as a field technique for supply cache marking in training environments. He had not explained why he was teaching it to her specifically. In the particular deliberate way you teach a thing, when you need it to survive inside a person, because you will not be there to use it yourself. She said, "I know why now." They moved northeast through the compressed intervals between Wareham's repositioning shooters, Calloway calling the windows, the element flowing through the grid with the precision of someone threading a needle in a dark room, trusting the thread more than they could trust their own eyes. 200 meters. The lodgepole pine was where the coordinates said it would be. A large specimen, 60 feet, the bark deeply furrowed in the pattern distinctive to its species. Calloway went to the north-facing surface of the root flare and crouched and looked and found it. 6 inches above ground level. A carved X, clean and precise, the cuts still pale against the darker bark, made by a man who had expected them to be found by exactly this person at exactly this kind of moment. She put her palm flat over the carved mark, the whole palm. She held it there for 2 seconds, not ceremony, something quieter than ceremony. The contact of a person acknowledging a gift they did not understand until they needed it. Then she stood and said, "Dig here." Aldgate detailed 2 rangers with entrenching tools, and they dug to 18 inches, and found the hardened pelican case, wrapped in a waterproof sleeve, sealed with a combination that Calloway provided without hesitation. She opened it. Inside was a server module, ruggedized, approximately the size of a hardback dictionary, with an integrated uplink antenna collapsed along its side, fully charged, waiting. She held it for a moment and looked at it with the expression of someone reading the last page of a long letter. All of it was there. Everything Carey had found and had not been able to deliver. Everything that proved what Rimrock had been and who had built it and who inside the institution had enabled it. The design documentation for Cascade Network across both versions. The full client correspondence including the SA-7 connection. The identity of the Army Acquisitions contact who had fed Wareham the operational data to make Rimrock possible and was still inside the institution, still active, still providing access. Korf said we need to authenticate the contents and uplink before Wareham can trigger a remote wipe. She said the uplink requires clear line of sight to the JBLM relay station. She said the ridgeline was blocking the signal from the ground. She said they needed a minimum of 80 feet of elevation to clear the ridge geometry and establish a direct transmission path. Calloway was already looking at the trees. And then footsteps, not from the grid positions, not from elevation. From 15 meters ahead in the timber, a single figure walking without concealment, without a weapon visible in either hand, palms turned outward at his sides in the oldest signal available to human beings. Cole Wareham. He stopped at 10 meters. He was a large man in his mid-50s with the physical economy of someone who had spent decades in environments where unnecessary movement was a liability. He moved through the forest with the ease of someone returning to a place they had never stopped belonging to. He looked at Calloway the way a person looks at something they have been thinking about for 22 months, not with hatred, not with fear. With the focused attention of someone confronting a problem that has resisted every previous solution and has arrived at what he believes to be the final one. He said this ends cleanly, or it does not end cleanly, and the choice belongs to her. Aldgate had his rifle up. 2 rangers flanked immediately. Corf covered the eastern approach. Wareham did not look at any of them. He looked at Calloway. He said, "I will stand down the remaining shooters. Your element exfills this corridor intact. In exchange, you leave the server module where it is and you walk away from Ironwood Pass and everything that happened here." He said, 8 people go home to their families tonight. That is what I am offering. He said it with the conviction of a man who genuinely believed this was the most reasonable offer available, which told Nolan more about Cole Wareham than anything in the file had. He had spent his career making decisions on the arithmetic of immediate survival, and the arithmetic had always worked, and so he had continued making it. And each time it worked, it confirmed for him that the framework was correct. He was applying the same framework now, and waiting for the professional on the other side of it to recognize its reasonableness. Calloway looked at him for a long moment. She said, "If I leave that server in the ground, the contact inside Army Acquisitions keeps their position. They keep their access. They keep supplying you, or whoever comes after you, with operational data for the next exercise. There will be another Rimrock. There will be another element that walks into a corridor that has been prepared for them. There will be another Floyd Carey." She said, "I cannot allow that." Wareham's expression did not change, but something behind it did. A small recalibration. The adjustment of a man who has just discovered that the variable he was most confident about was the one he had read incorrectly. He reached behind him, not for a weapon. He produced a device approximately the size of a television remote, black, with a single red indicator light that was currently not illuminated. He held it up so that everyone present could see exactly what it was and exactly what it meant. He said the server module contained a shaped charge, command detonated, radio triggered, sufficient to destroy the module and everything within a 4-meter radius. He said if he triggered it, there was nothing for quarrels. The archive was ash. The authentication was gone. The mission ended here with nothing to take back. He said his remaining shooters had the element in a crossfire that compressed every 30 seconds. He said she had approximately 90 seconds before the geometry became a problem with no clean resolution. The forest held this. Nolan Ashby looked at the detonator. He looked at the server module on the ground. He looked at Calloway, who was standing with her hand on the rifle and her eyes on Wareham, running the calculus of available decisions and their downstream consequences with the focused precision of someone who had learned that the difference between good decisions and poor ones was almost always the willingness to extend the calculation further than the immediate moment. He looked at Wareham. He thought about what he was carrying. He thought about 3 days ago in Quarles's office in the late afternoon light, the folder she had slid across the desk. He thought about the element he had not been briefed on. He thought about what she had said when he asked if he needed to be armed. He said, "Calloway, I need 90 seconds. She looked at him, not his face, through his face at the thing behind it, the thing he was not saying but was offering. She had been in the field long enough to distinguish between a man buying time and a man who had something real to spend. She looked at Wareham. She said, "Give him 90 seconds." Wareham looked at Nolan Ashby, a retired warrant officer. No weapon, no tactical position. A man standing in a forest with his hands at his sides and nothing visible to spend. Nolan said a name. He said it clearly and without emphasis, the way you read a name from a page. 4 syllables. A name that appeared in no deployment manifest, no element roster, no official document that anyone present had produced or reviewed. A name that existed in a file that had been moving through Army counterintelligence channels for 18 months. A file that Nolan had been working with access that was separate from his documentation role. Access that Quarles had arranged and had not explained to him until she handed him the folder 3 days ago and said, "This is why you are going." The red light on the detonator did not come on. Cole Wareham, who had stood in the presence of violence for 30 years without demonstrating anything that could be called fear, went still in a way that was categorically different from tactical stillness. It was the stillness of a man who has heard the precise sound of a door closing on the last available exit. After a long time, he said, "Where did you get that name?" Nolan said, "The same place Carrie got it." Another silence, longer than the first. Wareham lowered the detonator, not dramatically, quietly, the movement of a man making a final calculation and finding that the numbers had shifted in a direction he could not work around. The red indicator light remained dark. He said, "You had that before today." Nolan said, "I had it before Ironwood Pass." The remaining Ashgate contractors came down from the trees because Wareham told them to come down, and they did because they were contractors, and the contract had been redefined by the man who held it. Aldgate's rangers moved through them with zip ties and the professional efficiency of people who had been waiting for something they were trained to do and were relieved to finally be doing it. Korf was already preparing the server module for uplink. Calloway looked at Nolan. Not gratitude, not the currency between them, the look of someone who has revised their operational picture and wants the revision acknowledged without being described. She said, "Quarles sent you to be the closer." He said, "Quarles sent both of us, neither of us with the complete picture." She said, "Carrie would have found that appropriate." He waited. She said, "He always told me the most dangerous thing in any operation was a single person who knew everything." She said it quietly, in the tone of someone hearing for the first time the full sentence of a lesson that had been delivered in pieces across years. The way you say a thing when the saying of it finally makes the full shape of it visible. Nolan thought about Floyd Carey. He thought about what it meant to see something you were not supposed to see and to know from the moment of seeing it that you would not survive the knowing. He thought about the precision of what Carey had done with the time he had left, the 11 characters given to Korf, the cache marker taught to Calloway, the archive buried in a forest under a tree she would know how to find, each piece given to a different person, no single person holding the whole. The most dangerous thing in any operation is a single person who knows everything. Carey had understood this. He had distributed the knowledge the way you distribute load across a structure to prevent any single point from bearing enough weight to fail. He had trusted the right people. Calloway went to the base of the tallest hemlock in the immediate area, 88 feet high, its crown clearing the surrounding canopy, its upper branches in clear line of sight to the southwest, where the JBLM relay station sat 17 kilometers away on a ridgeline that Nolan could not see, but that the antenna geometry on the server module was built to find. She went up without ceremony, carrying the server module in a rigged carry against her chest, both hands free for the ascent. She moved through the lower section of the trunk, with the same evenness she had carried all morning, neither faster nor slower than the conditions required. At 88 feet, she settled into position at the crown. She extended the uplink antenna along the bearing Nolan had calculated. She aimed it toward the southwest. She held it steady. The wind was running at 14 knots across the ridgeline, and the temperature had dropped to 29 degrees. She held the antenna steady at 88 feet in that wind, and that cold, as if stillness were a physical substance she could produce on demand, rather than a condition that the body resisted. Below, Nolan watched the uplink indicator on Korf's tablet, a connecting icon, spinning, then a progress bar, thin and slow, climbing through its percentage increments with the patience of a process that did not care about urgency. He stood in the forest and watched the numbers climb and thought about all of it. About a man in a Montana cemetery, in a section of ground, reserved for people who died in the service of an institution that had not yet fully understood what it owed them. About the 11 characters of a decryption key that had been waiting 18 months inside a phone that a senior NCO had carried without opening, because a man she trusted had told her to wait. About a woman 88 feet above the forest floor holding an antenna steady in a 14-knot wind, because the man who had trained her had needed her to be capable of exactly this, and had made sure she was, and had not explained why, and had been right to trust her with it. The progress bar reached 100%. A single clean tone from Korf's tablet. Done. 88 feet above the ground, Ruth Calloway held the antenna steady for 3 more seconds after the tone. Then she lowered it. She did not move immediately. She remained in the convergence of branches at the crown of the hemlock and looked out over the canopy, over the pale gray-green expanse of old-growth forest stretching north and west under the October sky, over the place where 11 people had entered the grid that morning, and where all 11 of them were still alive. She looked out over all of it with the stillness of someone who has been carrying a thing for a long time and has just set it down in the right place, in the place it was always meant to reach. Nolan Ashby looked up at the place where she was sitting and said nothing. He waited for her to come back to the ground. She came down from the tree the same way she had gone up. No ceremony, no announcement. One branch at a time, weight tested before committed, the descent carrying the same evenness as the ascent, as if height were simply a variable in the problem rather than a condition to be overcome. At 40 feet, the wind that had been working against her at the crown dropped away, and the temperature rose by 2 degrees, small adjustments the forest made without being asked. At 20 feet, she was back inside the canopy's shelter, the pale October light filtering through the upper branches in long angled columns that made the forest floor look like the nave of something old and serious. She touched the ground and stood still for a moment, not resting, orienting. Nolan Ashby had been watching the place where she would land for the past 4 minutes. He had not looked away except twice. Once when Aldgate confirmed by radio that the last 2 Ashgate contractors had been secured and were sitting against a ponderosa pine with their backs straight and their eyes forward. Once when Korf said the uplink authentication had been received and logged at JBLM with a timestamp and a confirmation code she read aloud from the tablet screen. Both times he had looked back at the base of the hemlock before the sentence was finished. He had spent a career as a witness to other people's operations. He had written their records, analyzed their outcomes, translated their consequences into language that institutional process could use. He had been present at significant moments without being the person who made them significant. He understood this role and had accepted it long ago. What he was experiencing now was something adjacent to that but not identical. It was closer to the sense of being present at a thing that required a witness in order to be complete. A thing that would exist differently in the world because someone had watched it and understood what they were watching. She walked to where Wareham was seated on the ground with his back against a fallen log, wrists zip-tied in front of him, the detonator sitting 5 feet away on a flat stone where Aldgate had placed it after removing it from his hands. She stood over him and looked at him for a moment, and he looked back with the expression of a man who has run his final calculation and accepted the result without requiring it to be something other than what it is. She said, "You knew Carey sent something." Wareham said, "I suspected. After Rimrock, he was too methodical to go in without leaving a record somewhere. I spent 8 months trying to locate it." She said, "But you did not know where it was." He said, "I knew it was designed for you to find." He paused. "That was the problem. I could not find it because I am not you." She looked at him for another moment. There was nothing in her face that could be called satisfaction. There was a flatness that was not cold exactly, but was stripped of everything superfluous. The expression of someone who has been moving toward a fixed point for a long time and has arrived and is now standing at it, doing the inventory of what the arrival means. She turned away from him and walked to where Nolan was standing. She said, "The name you used to stop the detonator." He said, "Yes." She said, "Where did it come from?" He said, "Quarles gave it to me 3 days ago along with the mission folder. She told me it was for contingency use only. She told me I would know the contingency when it arrived." He paused. She was correct. She said, "Who is it?" He said, "The Army Acquisitions contact. The person who fed Wareham the operational data for Rimrock and every exercise before it." He said it without inflection. He said the name again, this time not for Wareham's benefit, just for hers. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know that name." He said, "Most people, with your operational history, would." She said he was at the Rimrock debrief. He was in the room when the investigation classified and closed. He was one of 4 people who signed the documentation that converted Rimrock into a training accident. Nolan said yes. She thought about this. The forest was quiet around them. The contractors were secured. The archive was uplinked and authenticated. The grid was down. She was standing in the middle of a morning that would take a long time to fully understand. She said Quarles knew his name before today. He said Quarles has known for some time. She said, "Then why today? Why this way?" He said, "Because knowing a name and being able to use it in a way that produces a legal and institutional result are different problems." He said, "You needed the archive. Quarles needed Wareham neutralized, and the archive authenticated under conditions that could withstand prosecutorial review. I needed the detonator not triggered. All 3 of those things required specific capabilities that no single person in this element possessed." He looked at her steadily. Carey understood this. Quarles understood it separately. They each designed around it from different positions. She said they designed around it without knowing the full shape of what the other was building. He said yes, neither of them had the complete picture. That was by design. She was quiet for a long time. She was looking at the hemlock she had just descended, at the place in the upper canopy where she had been sitting 88 feet above the ground, holding an antenna into the wind, while a server uploaded everything Floyd Carey had died protecting. She was looking at it the way you look at a thing you will not be able to fully understand for years, but want to begin the process of understanding now, while the details are still present and the weight of it is still fresh. She said that is exactly what Carey would have done. Nolan said, "I know." A sound came from the east. Rotors, faint at first, then building in the way that military helicopters build, the rhythm of them unmistakable and purposeful, descending through the gray October sky toward the corridor. 2 aircraft. Aldgate had an expression for the first time all morning that was not made of controlled professional composure. It was something quieter and more human than that. Nolan looked at the sky through the break in the canopy above the clearing and thought about what the next several hours would contain. Transport to JBLM. Debrief. Medical assessment for Tilney, for Lund, for the others who had taken fire or been in its proximity. Then the longer, slower work that came after the field work ended. The institutional machinery of prosecution and investigation and documentation. The work that was less visible than what happened in the forest, but without which what happened in the forest produced no permanent result. He thought about the name, the 4 syllables, the person who had been in that debrief room and signed those documents and had continued, afterward, to come to work every morning in the same building, where the people whose careers he had helped destroy also came to work every morning. He thought about the particular character of institutional betrayal, the way it recruited the institution's own credibility as the instrument of its damage. The way it was different from other kinds of betrayal, because it used the trust people placed in systems to make the damage harder to see and harder to name. He had been thinking about this for a long time, not just since Ironwood Pass, since before Quarles had given him the folder. He thought not much longer now. The helicopters broke over the ridgeline and descended into the corridor with the flat authority of aircraft that know exactly where they are going. Cole Wareham watched them come down from his position against the log. He watched with the focused attention of a man observing consequences arriving. His face was composed. He had operated for so long from a position of genuine personal conviction that even the collapse of the position did not produce the desperate recalibration that characterized a person who had never believed in anything beyond immediate self-interest. Wareham had believed. He had believed in the wrong framework, or in a legitimate framework pursued through methods that corrupted it beyond recognition, but the belief had been real. That made him more comprehensible than a simple mercenary. It made him, in a specific way, more troubling. The men who did the most damage to institutions were rarely the ones who hated them. They were the ones who had stopped trusting them and had built replacements. Nolan watched Aldgate's Rangers load the secured contractors into the second helicopter, with the brisk efficiency of people returning to familiar professional ground. He watched Korf secure the archive module and the Pelican cases, and the tactical tablets in a kit bag that she would not release to anyone who did not provide the right clearance code, which she had obtained from JBLM during the transmission window, and written in ink on the back of her left hand where she could verify it at any moment. She was thorough. Carrie had chosen well in trusting her with the encrypted file. People who carry things for 18 months without opening them, because someone they trusted asked them to wait, are people who can be trusted with the things that matter most. He looked for Calloway. She was at the tree line, not entering, not leaving, standing at the margin where the cleared ground of the landing zone met the first rank of old-growth timber, looking into the forest with the same particular stillness she had carried since the first shot of the morning. He walked to her. She did not look at him when he arrived. She was reading the trees, or perhaps she was no longer reading them in the tactical sense, but was simply standing in their presence the way a person stands in the presence of something that has held their life in its hands and has not crushed it. He stood beside her. After a while she said, "Carrie never told me why he taught me the cache marker." She said it without looking away from the trees. He said it was a field technique. He taught it the same way he taught everything, like it was just another skill, like it was something I would need someday without knowing when or why. That was how he taught. He never told you what for. He just made sure you had it. Nolan said good teachers work that way. She said he knew I would not be at Rimrock when it happened. He sent me up before the grid activated because he knew the grid was coming. He knew what Wareham was going to do, and he knew he could not abort the exercise without destroying the only evidence that proved the contact inside acquisitions existed, and he could not let that person stay protected. She said this with the flat, declarative clarity of someone who has been working through a thing for a long time and has finally arrived at its full shape. So he chose. He chose to go in. He sent me up. He gave me the file through Corf and the marker through training and the key in the form of 11 characters I memorized without understanding they were a key. And then he walked into a forest that had been built to kill him. Nolan said nothing. She said he chose that. He said yes. She said I have been carrying the wrong accounting for 22 months. I thought I owed him a death. I thought what I owed him was Wareham's life in exchange for his. She said that is not what he left me. He waited. She said he left me a job. He said it like it was nothing. He taught it to me like it was just another skill in a long list of skills. But it was the whole thing. It was everything he could not finish. The last page of something he started years before Rimrock. The rotors of the first helicopter were building toward departure. The sound filled the corridor and moved through the timber in waves, bending the grass at the clearing's edge and lifting fallen leaves in small, slow spirals. Nolan felt the air change against his face. The morning's cold was still present, but something underneath it had shifted. The way temperature shifts before weather arrives, the body registering a change that the eyes have not confirmed yet. He said, "What will you do?" She said, "Finish it." He said, "There is more to tell you before the debrief." She looked at him. He said, "The archive contains the correspondence and the design documentation and the client list and the name we already know." He said it carefully, selecting the right pace. "It also contains something Carey recorded himself. An audio file. I have not heard it. Quarles told me it exists. She told me Calloway should hear it before the formal debrief. She told me it was not operational. It was personal." Calloway looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the kit bag on Corf's shoulder across the clearing. She said later. He understood. There are things that can only be opened when the operational weight of a day has been set down, when the hands are no longer needed for anything else, and the mind can receive what is being offered without dividing its attention between the receiving and the doing. She had been doing all morning. The receiving required the doing to be finished first. He said yes, later. The first helicopter lifted. The sound of it diminished up into the gray sky, and the forest closed back around the corridor, immense and old and permanent in the way that old-growth forests are permanent, their scale making the events that occurred at their base small without making them insignificant. He walked back toward the second helicopter slowly, because he was 58 years old and had spent a long morning moving through cold air, and because the slow walk gave him time to look at the corridor one more time, at the arrangement of the trees and the quality of the light coming through them, at the positions in the canopy that had been occupied this morning by men who had been paid to occupy them, and who were now somewhere in the back of a helicopter, with the rest of their lives reshaped. He thought about the hexagonal grid, about the mathematical precision of what Wareham had built and the specific way it had failed, not because the geometry was wrong, because the geometry had been read. You could build a perfect system and it would still be only as effective as its blind spot allowed. Wareham's blind spot had been his certainty that the system was unreadable from within. He had never considered the possibility that someone existed who had seen it from the inside, who had been sent into a version of it without knowing what it was, and who had spent 22 months processing what she had seen until she could name every node by its position and every gap by its degree of arc. He did not know the right official designation for what Ruth Calloway was. The official designations were inadequate. She was something the institution had trained, and then failed to recognize it had trained, the way institutions sometimes produce capabilities they have no framework to retain. Carrie had recognized it. That was why he had taught her what he taught her. That was why he had sent her up the tree. She was still at the tree line when Nolan reached the helicopter. He looked back at her. She was standing at the margin of the forest with one hand resting against the bark of the nearest tree, not leaning, not resting her weight against it, the contact light and deliberate, the way a person touches something they are not going to see again for a while and want to acknowledge before they leave. Then she took her hand off the tree and walked toward the helicopter without looking back. 6 weeks later, the morning was different. JBLM in early December had the quality of all military installations in winter, the buildings solid and low against a gray sky, the distances between them crossed by people who moved with purpose because the cold did not reward dawdling. Nolan arrived at Colonel Quarles's office at 0800 and found that Calloway was already there, standing at the window with a cup of coffee that had been cooling for some time. She was in the uniform she was now authorized to wear again, the Army combat uniform in OCP multicam, with the rank and designations that had been returned to her by a process that had moved through the administrative machinery with unusual speed. 6 weeks from Ironwood passed to full reinstatement, which in Nolan's experience of institutional process was approximately 14 weeks faster than normal, and which told him something about the extent of what Quarles had been holding in reserve for the moment when the archive made it usable. Quarles was behind her desk with the contained energy of someone who has been inside a long process and can see the end of it clearly enough to have stopped sleeping fully. She looked at Nolan when he came in and said, "Sit down." He sat. She said Wareham had been transferred to federal custody the previous morning. The charges were being processed in coordination with the Department of Justice and the Office of the Inspector General. It would be a long case. The foreign client representatives had been detained at a secondary location by personnel with different authorities than hers. She said this with the measured efficiency of someone reading items off a list they had been maintaining for a long time and were now finally able to begin crossing off. She said the Army Acquisitions contact had been arrested 6 days ago, not at JBLM, in Washington. He had been removed from his office on a Tuesday afternoon in a manner that was, by all accounts, quiet and without incident, because men who have been inside an institution long enough know that performing resistance confirms everything they are trying to deny. He had been cooperative with the initial interview, in the way of people who have been waiting a long time for the thing they feared to arrive, and find the actual arrival less unbearable than the anticipation of it. She paused. She looked at Calloway, who was still at the window and had not moved since Nolan entered. She said he confirmed the Rimrock record. He confirmed the classification decision. He confirmed the sequence of events that produced the training accident designation and the speed with which the file had been sealed. His cooperation was not exculpatory. His cooperation was what it was, which was useful to the case and nothing more. Calloway turned from the window. She looked at Quarles with the same flatness she had carried through the morning at Ironwood Pass, the expression that was not cold but was stripped of anything the situation had not earned. She said, "I have one question." Quarles said, "Ask it." She said, "Carey came to you before Rimrock. He found the correspondence and he came to you directly." Quarles was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes." She said, "And you assessed the probability that he would not survive the exercise." Quarles said, "I assessed the probability as high, yes." She said, "And he knew you assessed it that way." Quarles said, "Yes. We discussed it directly." She said this without flinching, which was the only way to say something like this, because flinching would have been a performance and Floyd Carey had not been a man who was served by performances. She said he understood that aborting the exercise without stated cause would alert the contact and destroy the evidence and allow the system to continue producing exactly what it had produced. He understood what the alternative meant. He made his decision. She paused. I did not argue with it because arguing with it would have been a form of disrespect toward a man who had the right to make his own accounting of his own life. The room was quiet. Calloway looked at Quarles for a long time. Quarles held the look without deflection, because this was a thing that required two people willing to hold it without looking for an exit, and both of them were. Calloway said he chose it. Quarles said yes. She said it was not taken from him. He chose it. Quarles said he chose it completely. He told me to make sure Calloway was in the corridor. He said she will know what to do. He said it 2 days before Rimrock, and those were the last words of consequence he spoke to me. She paused again, longer this time. He was correct. She said that should mean something to you. It means something to me every day. The silence that came after this was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 3 people who have arrived at the same place by different routes and are pausing at it before deciding what comes next. Nolan had been watching Calloway's face through the conversation with the attention he had trained over 27 years, reading the small adjustments of expression that told him what a person was doing with information as they received it. What he saw was layered in the way things are layered when they have been building for a long time, and the final piece arrives, and the whole structure settles into its full weight. There was grief in it still, because grief of that duration does not resolve in a single conversation. Alongside it was something else, the quality of a weight that has been reoriented, not lighter, differently distributed, carried by different muscles than the ones that had been straining for 22 months. Quarles opened her desk drawer. She produced a folder and set it on the desk between them. She said your Scout Sniper designation, reinstated with full back period credit. Assignment to 1st SFAB at your request or reassignment to Training Cadre at mine. She said your call. Calloway looked at the folder. She did not open it. She did not need to, because the contents were not what mattered, and both of them understood this. What mattered was what the folder represented. The institutional acknowledgement that a wrong had been done and was being corrected, which was not the same as the wrong being undone, because wrongs of that kind are not undone, but which was the closest the institution was capable of coming to saying what it needed to say. She picked up the folder, she held it. Then she said Training Cadre, she said Ironwood Pass. Quarles said, you want to train in the corridor. She said I want to train people to read the corridor, to recognize what gets built there when someone decides it is a suitable place to test a system on people who do not know they are inside a test. She said the next version of Cascade Network is already somewhere. Someone received the design before Wareham was arrested. Someone is building from it right now. The people who will be walked into it deserve to know it exists and deserve to know how to read it from the ground and from the air, and from 80 feet up in a tree in a 14-knot wind. Quarles looked at her for a moment. Then she said yes. She wrote something on the interior of the folder and slid it back across the desk. Done. Calloway took the folder and held it against her side and looked at Quarles, and then at Nolan with the expression of someone who has closed a ledger, and is now looking at the space where it used to sit, deciding what belongs there instead. She said the audio file Carey left in the archive. Quarles said it is in the authenticated copy. You have access. She said I heard it last night. No one asked what was in it. No one needed to ask. The content of a thing a man leaves for the person he trusts most is not a matter for institutional record, and both Quarles and Nolan understood this without requiring it to be stated. Calloway said he knew. She said it quietly, to the middle distance, in the tone of someone confirming a thing they have been turning over since the previous night. He knew the cache would be found. He knew the archive would reach the right people. He knew the name would be said in the right room at the right moment. She said he built all of it in 11 days. He taught me the marker and gave Korf the file and recorded the audio and buried a server in a forest under a tree he knew I would know how to find. She paused. And the only personal thing he said in the recording, the only thing that was not operational instruction, was that he hoped I understood that none of it was my fault and all of it was his choice. He said, "I need you to stay in the trees, Calloway." He said that is where you belong. The room held this. Outside the window, the installation moved through its December morning in the gray light. Trucks crossing the apron. Figures in uniform moving between buildings with purpose. The ordinary machinery of a military base, which was never at rest, only at varying degrees of preparation for the thing that comes next. Nolan thought about what it meant to spend a career inside an institution. The particular combination of pride and grief and frustration and loyalty that characterized everyone he had known who had done it honestly. The way the institution was always simultaneously better and worse than the people who served it. The way it failed its best people with a consistency that should have been discouraging but somehow was not, because the best people kept coming back, kept training the next cohort, kept building the things that would be needed by people who had not yet been born into the problem. Carey had done this. He had failed to survive and had succeeded at everything else. That was a particular kind of record, not the kind that appeared in official documentation, the kind that appeared in the way people who had been touched by it moved through the world afterward. He looked at Ruth Calloway, 33 years old, standing in Colonel Quarles's office in her reinstated uniform, holding a folder that represented 6 weeks of administrative process and 22 months of something that had no official name. She was going back to Ironwood Pass to teach people to read what had been built there and what could be built anywhere like it. She would be good at this in the way that people are good at teaching the things they learned through the kind of experience that removes the distance between knowledge and understanding and leaves them occupying the same space. She would carry Floyd Carey the way we carry the people we lose to the largest decisions, not as a ghost, not as an absence, as an orientation, the way a compass carries north. You do not see north. You see the needle pointing toward it. You learn to move accordingly. He stood up. He said it was time. She nodded. She walked to the door and opened it and held it, and Nolan walked through, and she followed. And the door closed behind them in the quiet way doors close when the conversation inside has been completed, and the work that comes next is somewhere else entirely. They walked out into the December morning. The air was cold and still, and carried the particular sharpness of a Pacific Northwest winter. The trees at the edge of the installation were tall and dark against the pale sky. Western hemlock, Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, old growth that had been there before the base was built and would be there long after everything built on this ground had returned to foundation and memory. Calloway looked at the trees as they walked. Nolan did not look at the trees. He looked at her looking at the trees and thought about all the things he had not been told before Ironwood Pass, and all the things that had been exactly right about not being told them. The way information withheld at the right moment arrives with a force that direct instruction never produces. The way a thing you discover yourself becomes part of you in a different way than a thing you are handed. He thought Carey knew. He thought Carey was right. They reached the vehicle and Nolan's phone produced a notification from an address he recognized as belonging to a contact in the Inspector General's office who had been running a parallel track on the Army acquisitions file for 3 weeks. He read the message. He read it once more. He put the phone in his pocket. Calloway looked at him across the roof of the vehicle. He said there is a secondary server. The acquisition's contact maintained a backup data set independent of the Ashgate network. The IG tracked the transmission destination to a location in the Cascade Range, approximately 40 miles east of the JBLM boundary. He said Cascade Network version 2 is on that server. Along with correspondence the contact maintained separately from Wareham, correspondence with parties whose identities have not yet been established. He said the IG has the location and the authorization, and does not have the personnel with the right combination of capabilities to retrieve it cleanly. He looked at her across the roof of the vehicle. She was looking at the trees at the edge of the installation. The pale winter light was in them, making the space between the trunks luminous and deep. The quality of a forest that is offering something if you know how to read what it is offering. She said, "How tall are the trees?" He said, "Old growth, same as ironwood." She said nothing for a moment. Then she opened the vehicle door. She said, "Then we should leave before it gets dark." Nalan opened his door. He sat down. He looked through the windshield at the road leading out of the installation toward the tree line, the straight military road giving way to the winding civilian road beyond the gate, the winding road becoming something narrower and less certain in the distance. He thought about 40 miles east. He thought about old growth. He thought about a woman who had been sent into a forest 22 months ago and had come out carrying something she did not yet understand, and who had spent the intervening time becoming the person capable of using it. He thought about what it meant to finish what the dead started. Not to avenge it, not to memorialize it, to finish it, to carry it to the end it was always intended to reach, and to set it down there in the right place, having done what it was built to do. He started the vehicle. Outside the window, the installation trees passed by, and then the gate passed by, and then they were on the winding road with old growth on both sides. And somewhere 40 miles to the east, the same kind of forest was holding a server inside a sealed case, inside a buried cache beneath a tree that no one had been taught to find yet. No one except the person in the seat beside him. He drove.